December 17th, 1944. A snow-covered ridgeline in eastern Belgium. Through the morning fog, Sergeant Frank Currey of the 2nd Infantry Division could hear them coming. Not the crack of rifle fire or the distant thump of mortars, but something else, something that made the frozen ground beneath his foxhole tremble. Tank engines, dozens of them, grinding through the forest below Elsenborn Ridge in low gear, their steel tracks chewing through mud and ice as they climbed toward American positions that weren't supposed to be there. Currey pressed himself against the frozen earth and listened. The sound grew louder, closer. Then, through breaks in the fog, he saw them. Panther tanks, Panzer Mark IVs, half-tracks packed with SS Panzer grenadiers wearing winter camouflage over their field grey uniforms. They were advancing in formation, professional and disciplined, exactly as they'd been trained. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, elite troops who'd cut through French defences in Normandy and fought the British to a standstill at Caen. Young men, many still teenagers, who'd been taught since childhood that the Reich was invincible and that death in battle was the highest honour. They were climbing toward a ridge that German intelligence said was lightly defended. A few exhausted American infantry companies, some machine gun nests. Nothing that couldn't be overrun in an hour, maybe less. What German intelligence hadn't said, what their reconnaissance couldn't have known, was that behind Currey's position, dug into carefully surveyed firing positions across 3 miles of ridgeline, were 348 American artillery pieces, all of them registered on the exact approaches the Panzers were using, all of them connected by field telephone to forward observers who could see every meter of ground between the tree line and the American foxholes. And all of them waiting. In 90 minutes, the hillside below Elsenborn Ridge would become what American soldiers would later call the Panzer graveyard, the place where Hitler's last great offensive in the West died. Not from a lack of German courage or American bravery, though both were present in abundance. It died because of mathematics, because of coordination, because of an artillery technique that German doctrine had never accounted for and that SS commanders, in their final moments, never understood. This is the story of how 300 American gunners, most of them miles behind the front line, destroyed an entire SS Panzer division without ever seeing the enemy they were killing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The ridge itself was an accident of geography. Elsenborn Ridge ran roughly north to south through eastern Belgium, a series of low hills and dense forest that rose perhaps 300 feet above the surrounding terrain. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would catch your eye on a map, but to a military planner, it was everything. The ridge controlled every major road running east to west through that sector. Control the ridge and you controlled movement. Lose the ridge and your entire offensive became a traffic jam. Tanks and trucks backed up for miles on narrow forest roads with nowhere to go. In November of 1944, the ridge wasn't even supposed to be important. The war was almost over. Everyone said so. Allied forces had liberated France, driven across Belgium, and were preparing to punch through Germany's western border. The Germans were finished, beaten. Their army was a shell, their industry in ruins, their cities burning under daily bombardment. All that remained was the final push into the Reich itself, and then the war would end, probably by Christmas. The Ardennes sector where Elsenborn Ridge sat was quiet, so quiet that Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force used it as a rest area. Divisions that had fought through Normandy and across France were rotated into the Ardennes to recover. Raw divisions fresh from the United States were sent there to get acclimated before being thrown into real combat. It was the Ghost Front, the place where nothing happened. Major General Walter Robertson commanded the 2nd Infantry Division, one of the veteran units sent to the Ardennes for rest after brutal fighting to breach the German Siegfried Line. His men were exhausted. Many were sick with trench foot and respiratory infections from weeks in cold, wet foxholes. They needed time to recover, to get hot meals, to sleep without artillery fire waking them every few hours. But Robertson was a careful man, a professional who'd learned in the First World War that overconfidence killed more soldiers than enemy action. So even though the sector was quiet, even though intelligence reported minimal German activity, he ordered his division to dig in properly. That meant defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge, foxholes with overhead cover, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, anti-tank guns positioned to cover the approaches, And most importantly, artillery. Robertson's division had 4 battalions of artillery organic to the division, 105mm howitzers, the workhorses of American field artillery. But Robertson wanted more. He requested and received attachment of additional corps and army artillery, bigger guns, 155mm howitzers that could throw a 95-pound shell more than 8 miles, even heavier pieces. By early December, Robertson had more artillery supporting his division than most entire corps possessed. The guns were positioned in carefully surveyed firing positions behind the ridge. Survey teams had spent weeks measuring distances and angles, calculating firing data for every possible target area. Forward observers were positioned on the ridge itself with field telephones connecting them directly to fire direction centers. The entire system was designed around a simple principle. When German forces attacked, if they attacked, American artillery would be able to respond within seconds, not minutes. Seconds. What Robertson didn't know, what no Allied commander knew, was that 3 German armies, totaling more than 200,000 men and over 400 tanks, were massing in the forests less than 10 miles from his positions. Adolf Hitler had scraped together every reserve, every replacement, every tank that could still run, and committed them to one final desperate offensive. The objective was Antwerp, the great Belgian port through which nearly all Allied supplies flowed. Capture Antwerp, and you split the Allied armies, force the British and Americans to negotiate, buy time for new weapons, jet aircraft and ballistic missiles, to turn the tide. It was madness. Every German general said so. They didn't have the fuel. They didn't have the air support. The Americans were too strong, too well supplied. But Hitler insisted, and so the Panzers rolled west through the winter darkness, crews shivering in their steel boxes, wondering if they'd live to see another sunrise. At the tip of the spear was the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, an old party fighter, a Hitler loyalist, a man whose military competence was questionable but whose political reliability was absolute. His army included the elite SS Panzer divisions, the 1st SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the 12th SS Hitler Youth, units that had won every decoration Germany could offer, units that had earned reputations for both tactical excellence and absolute brutality. The 12th SS was something special, even among the Waffen-SS. Its soldiers had been recruited starting in 1943 from the Hitler Youth Organization. Boys born in 1926, 18 years old when they joined, 17 when they were recruited. They'd grown up, under National Socialism, known nothing else. Been taught from childhood that Jews were vermin, that Slavs were subhuman, that the German people were destined to rule Europe. They believed it with the absolute certainty that only adolescents can achieve. In Normandy, they'd fought with fanatical determination. They'd also murdered Canadian prisoners, shot them after they'd surrendered. The 12th SS had earned a reputation that preceded them. When word spread that the Hitler Youth Division was in a sector, Allied soldiers knew. No quarter, no mercy. Just killing until one side or the other was destroyed. Now, in December of 1944, the 12th SS was reconstituted after being nearly destroyed in France. New tanks, new recruits, many even younger than the original cohort. 15 and 16-year-olds pressed into service as Germany scraped the bottom of its manpower barrel. Boys who should have been in school were instead crewing Panther tanks and learning how to die for the Führer. Their mission was simple: break through the American lines, seize the road network around Elsenborn Ridge, drive west to the Meuse River, and then to Antwerp. Speed was everything. The plan assumed that American forces in the Ardennes were weak, demoralized, unprepared. That SS Panzers could roll over them in hours. That by the time Allied command figured out what was happening, German forces would be halfway to the coast. It was a plan built on assumptions. And every single assumption was wrong. At 0530 hours on December 16, 1944, the German offensive began with the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since Normandy. 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front. Shells rained down on American positions in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound was overwhelming, deafening. Trees exploded into splinters. Foxholes collapsed. Communications lines were severed. Men who'd been sleeping in their positions jerked awake to find the world ending around them. The 99th Infantry Division, a green unit that had arrived in the Ardennes only weeks earlier, took the brunt of the initial assault. Their positions were overrun. Companies were surrounded and captured. Entire battalions retreated in confusion through the forest, trying to find friendly lines that no longer existed. German infantry poured through the gaps, advancing rapidly against minimal resistance. Behind them came the Panzers. By midday on the 16th, German forces had penetrated several miles into American territory. The offensive was succeeding. The breakthrough was happening. But not everywhere. On the northern shoulder of the offensive, where the 12th SS Panzer Division was supposed to smash through toward Elsenborn Ridge, something different was happening. The American units there, elements of the 99th Division and Robertson's 2nd Division, were fighting back, not running, not surrendering. Fighting, small unit actions, platoons holding crossroads until they were wiped out, artillery observers staying at their posts, calling in fire missions even as German infantry closed in around them. Buying time, minutes, hours. Enough time for Robertson to realize what was happening and react. By the evening of December 16th, Robertson had begun repositioning his forces. The 2nd Division fell back from the Siegfried Line positions they'd been holding and moved to Elsenborn Ridge. Not a rout, a fighting withdrawal. Units leapfrogging backward, covering each other, maintaining cohesion even as German pressure mounted. It was textbook, professional, the kind of maneuver that separates trained soldiers from amateurs. Robertson was establishing a defensive line on terrain he'd already prepared. He was concentrating his forces, and he was bringing his artillery to bear. The Germans didn't understand what was happening. Their intelligence said the Americans were retreating in panic. Breaking. The SS commanders pushed harder, faster. The breakthrough was within reach. Just one more push, one more attack. Then they'd be through, and nothing would stop them. On December 17th, as morning fog rolled across Elsenborn Ridge, the 12th SS Panzer Division received its orders. Attack, breakthrough, drive west. The Panzers formed up in the valleys below the ridge. Officers synchronized their movements. Panzer grenadiers climbed aboard their half-tracks. Everyone knew this was it. The decisive moment. Breakthrough or die trying. SS Sturmbannführer Arnold Jürgensen commanded one of the Panzer battalions moving forward that morning. 32 years old, veteran of the Russian front. Iron Cross 1st and 2nd class. A professional soldier who'd learned his trade in the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, where entire divisions vanished in weeks of combat. He'd seen what Soviet artillery could do, massive barrages that turned square kilometers into moonscapes. But the Americans were different. Everyone said so. American infantry was soft, poorly trained. Their artillery was good, yes, but scattered, uncoordinated. The Americans fought with material, not with skill. Throw enough tanks at them and they'd break. They always did. Jürgensen's battalion had 28 Panther tanks. Each weighed 45 tons. Each mounted a 75mm gun that could penetrate American tank armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. They were the best tanks Germany had produced in quantity, better protected than the American Shermans, better armed. With good crews, they were nearly invincible. Jürgensen's crews were survivors. They'd fought through Normandy and the retreat across France. They knew their trade. As his battalion advanced up the slope toward Elsenborn Ridge through the morning fog, Jürgensen felt confident, not arrogant, confident. His tanks were good, his men were good, and the enemy ahead was supposedly disorganized, retreating. One more push, and they'd break through. The first American positions they encountered were infantry foxholes at the base of the ridge. Riflemen from the 38th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Division, the Americans opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, bazookas, small arms. Jürgensen's Panzers returned fire, their main guns and machine guns raking the American positions. It was a fierce fight but brief. The Americans couldn't stop tanks with small arms. They fell back, retreating up the slope towards secondary positions. Jürgensen pressed forward. Standard tactics. Keep moving. Don't give the enemy time to organize. Break through while they're off balance. Then the artillery started. Not scattered fire. Not random shells dropping here and there. Concentrated fire. Dozens of shells arriving simultaneously. Explosions erupted across the entire approach route his battalion was using. Not walking fire that you could predict and avoid. Simultaneous impact. Shells from different guns, fired from different positions miles apart, all arriving at the same instant. Time on target fire. The Americans had developed this technique in the years before the war. The theory was simple. Most casualties in an artillery barrage occurred in the first few seconds before troops could take cover. Therefore, maximize the number of shells arriving in those first few seconds. Coordinate fire from multiple batteries so that dozens of shells arrived simultaneously. No warning shots, no ranging rounds, just sudden, overwhelming devastation. The technique required precise survey data, excellent communications, and sophisticated fire direction calculations. Most armies couldn't do it. The Americans could. They'd been practicing for years. What Jurgensen experienced that morning wasn't an artillery barrage in any conventional sense. It was a mathematical execution. Fire direction centers miles behind American lines received target coordinates from forward observers on the Panzer Ridge. Within seconds, they calculated firing data for every available gun, not just divisional artillery, corps artillery, army artillery, guns positioned across 3 different sectors, all focused on the approaches to Elsenborn Ridge. The calculations accounted for each gun's distance from the target, the time of flight for each shell. The goal was simple. Every shell, regardless of where it was fired from, would arrive at the target at the same instant, plus or minus 3 seconds. The result was catastrophic. Jurgensen's lead company, advancing in column formation through a narrow valley, disappeared in a storm of explosions. High explosive shells detonated in airbursts above the tanks, showering them with white-hot shrapnel that shredded antennas and periscopes. Shells landing among the half-tracks carrying Panzer grenadiers turned infantry into red mist. The fog that had provided concealment now trapped the smoke and dust, reducing visibility to meters. Jurgensen couldn't see what was happening to his forward elements. He only heard the explosions and the screaming over the radio. He ordered his battalion to disperse. Get off the road, spread out, reduce the density of targets. His surviving tanks fanned out across the hillside, trying to present more difficult targets for the American gunners. It didn't matter. The artillery followed them. Forward observers on the ridge could see through the fog better than Jurgensen realized. American artillery doctrine emphasized the use of multiple observers for each fire mission. If one observer lost sight of the target, another picked it up. The fire never stopped. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Detmer commanded a Panther company in Jurgensen's battalion. 24 years old, Hitler Youth member since age 14, true believer. His tank was hit by 3 shells in the span of 10 seconds. Not direct hits that would have penetrated the armor, but near misses that damaged the tracks and transmission. The Panther ground to a halt, immobilized. Detmer ordered his crew to bail out. Standard procedure when your tank couldn't move and you were under fire. Get clear before something hit the ammunition or fuel tanks. They made it perhaps 20 meters before the next salvo arrived. Detmer survived because he dove into a shell crater an instant before the explosions. When he looked up, his crew was gone. Just gone. Bodies torn apart by shrapnel. He lay in that crater for 3 hours, listening to his battalion die around him. Every time he tried to move, more shells arrived. The Americans weren't firing randomly. They were firing at specific targets identified by observers who could see everything. Knocked out tanks, disabled vehicles, clusters of infantry trying to take cover. The fire was methodical, precise, relentless. By noon on December 17th, Jurgensen's battalion had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of 28 Panthers that had started the attack, 19 were destroyed or immobilized. Of the supporting infantry, perhaps half had become casualties. The survivors were scattered across the hillside in whatever cover they could find, pinned down by artillery fire that never seemed to end. Jurgensen himself was wounded by shrapnel. Nothing serious, just enough to make movement painful and thinking difficult. He radioed division headquarters for permission to withdraw. The response was immediate and unambiguous. No withdrawal. Attack. Take the ridge. The 12th SS was commanded by SS Standartenführer Hugo Krass, a veteran officer, competent by SS standards, which meant he could read a map and understood logistics. He was under immense pressure. The entire German offensive was behind schedule. The 6th Panzer Army was supposed to be halfway to the Meuse by now. Instead, they were stuck fighting for a ridge that shouldn't have been defended. Krass needed a breakthrough, needed it desperately. So he committed more units, fresh battalions, more tanks, more infantry, all driving toward the same objective, Elsenborn Ridge. The Americans were ready. Fire direction centers had pre-planned concentrations covering every approach. registered targets marked on maps. All an observer had to do was identify which concentration number covered the area where Germans were massing and call it in. Within 30 seconds, shells would be in the air. Within 60 seconds, they'd be impacting. The Germans never had a chance to mass their forces properly. Every time they tried to concentrate for an attack, American artillery broke them apart. Lieutenant Jack Madison commanded a forward observer team from the 15th Field Artillery Battalion. His position was a foxhole on the forward slope of the ridge with a clear view of the valley below. He had a field telephone connecting him directly to the Fire Direction Center, a map, binoculars, and the best seat in the house for watching the destruction of an SS Panzer division. Madison had been trained at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the Army's artillery school. The training emphasized speed and accuracy. Identify the target, calculate the range, call in the fire mission, observe the impact, adjust if necessary, repeat until the target is destroyed. What Madison observed that day exceeded anything his instructors had described. German forces advancing across his sector were being engaged by guns he couldn't even see. Batteries positioned miles away, firing over the ridge, dropping shells with precision that seemed impossible. The Americans had another advantage the Germans didn't fully appreciate: proximity fuses. Variable time fuses that used radio waves to detect when a shell was near the ground and detonated automatically at optimal height for maximum fragmentation effect. The technology was top secret, so secret that the Americans hadn't used it against ground targets earlier in the war for fear the Germans would capture unexploded rounds and reverse engineer the fuses. But on December 17th, with the entire northern shoulder of the offensive at stake, the restriction was lifted. American shells began detonating in airbursts above German positions, showering troops and vehicles with shrapnel from above where armor was thinnest and soldiers had no protection. The effect was devastating. German infantry advancing through forests found no cover from artillery that exploded in the treetops. Tank crews buttoned up inside their vehicles discovered that proximity-fused shells could damage external equipment, antennas, periscopes, anything exposed, even if they couldn't penetrate the armor itself. Krass tried everything. He attacked at night when American observers couldn't see as well. The Americans fired pre-planned concentrations on likely assembly areas and approach routes. Shells dropped on Germans, whether the observers could see them or not. He tried attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Americans simply divided their artillery support, bringing fire down on each separate attack. He tried using smoke to conceal his movements. American radar could detect incoming mortar and artillery fire, calculate the trajectory backward, and provide counter-battery fire on German gun positions within minutes. The Germans couldn't suppress American artillery because they couldn't find it all and didn't have enough ammunition to saturate the areas where it might be. On December 18th, Krass committed his reserve, the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, fresh troops who hadn't been chewed up in the initial attacks. Their objective was Dom Buchenbach, a small village just west of Elsenborn Ridge, held by the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. Veterans who'd landed in North Africa in 1942 and fought through Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. Men who'd seen everything the German army could throw at them and were still here. The attack began at dawn with German artillery preparation. Not the massive barrage that had opened the offensive, but enough to make American soldiers keep their heads down. Then the Panzer Grenadiers advanced with tank support. Young SS soldiers in camouflage smocks, moving through the snow in squad formations. Professional, well-trained, determined. They reached the outskirts of Dom Buchenbach and pushed into the village. House-to-house fighting. Germans clearing buildings with grenades and machine pistols. Americans falling back to secondary positions. For a moment, it looked like the SS might actually take the objective. Then the artillery arrived, not supporting the American infantry, destroying the German infantry. The 1st Infantry Division's artillery was concentrated under the command of the Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Cliff Andrews. He controlled every gun attached to the division, over 100 pieces. All their fire was coordinated through a single fire direction center. When the call came in that Germans had penetrated Dom Buchenbach, Andrews didn't hesitate. He ordered a time-on-target mission, every available gun, maximum rate of fire. Target was the village itself, specifically the areas German forces were occupying. The Americans had already evacuated most civilians. What remained was stone buildings and German soldiers. In 8 minutes, American artillery delivered over 1,000 rounds into Dom Butgenbach, not scattered over hours. 1,000 rounds in 8 minutes. The village disintegrated. Stone walls collapsed. Roofs caved in. Germans caught in the open were shredded. Those in buildings were crushed when structures collapsed on top of them. The few Panthers that had made it into the village were immobilized by rubble blocking the streets. Their crews abandoned them and tried to retreat on foot through the artillery fire. SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Vogel commanded a Panzer Grenadier platoon in that attack. He survived because he was in the basement of a building when the bombardment started. The building collapsed around him. He and 3 of his men dug themselves out through rubble and crawled back toward German lines through shell craters and destroyed streets. It took them 6 hours to cover less than a kilometer. When they finally reached friendly positions, Vogel looked back at Dom Butgenbach. The village was burning. Smoke rose in a column visible for miles. His platoon had started the attack with 42 men. 7 made it back. The mathematics of what was happening at Elsenborn Ridge were brutal and undeniable. German forces were attacking uphill against prepared defenses, supported by artillery that outnumbered and outranged their own guns. Every German advance had to cross ground that American observers could see and that American gunners had already registered. The Germans couldn't bring enough combat power to bear at any single point to achieve breakthrough because artillery destroyed their formations before they could mass. They couldn't suppress the American artillery because they couldn't locate all the firing positions and didn't have enough ammunition to engage the ones they did find. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. American artillery doctrine emphasized decentralization and rapid response. Battery commanders had authority to fire on targets of opportunity without waiting for higher approval. Fire direction centers could shift fires from one target to another in seconds. The entire system was designed to be flexible and responsive. German doctrine, by contrast, was more rigid. Artillery was centrally controlled at higher headquarters. Fire missions required approval through multiple layers of command. By the time German gunners received permission to fire, their targets had often moved. The Americans also had better communications. Every forward observer had a radio or field telephone connecting him directly to fire direction centers. Germans relied more heavily on radio, which could be jammed or intercepted, or runners, who were slow and vulnerable. American survey techniques were more accurate, which meant their artillery was more precise. American ammunition supply was essentially unlimited. Trucks brought shells forward constantly. Germans were rationed. Each gun had a daily allocation of ammunition that couldn't be exceeded without special permission. By December 20th, the 12th SS Panzer Division was combat ineffective. They'd lost over 40% of their tanks and armored vehicles. Infantry casualties were approaching 50%. Entire companies had been wiped out. The division could no longer conduct offensive operations. They could barely defend the ground they held. Krass requested permission to withdraw and reorganize. Hitler's response came through Dietrich: no withdrawal, hold and attack. The Führer's orders were absolute. The Americans weren't content to just defend. Robertson began planning counterattacks to push the Germans back from the ridge. Limited objective attacks by combined tank and infantry teams, supported by, naturally, overwhelming artillery. The pattern was consistent. American forces would advance under cover of a rolling barrage, shells landing in a line in front of them, marching forward at a predictable rate. The infantry followed closely behind the barrage. By the time they reached German positions, the defenders had been suppressed or killed by artillery. What remained was mopping up. On December 22nd, the Americans launched one such attack toward a small forest where German forces had established positions. The artillery preparation lasted 30 minutes. 1,500 rounds delivered onto an area roughly 800 meters square. When American infantry entered the forest, they found German soldiers still in their positions, dead, not from shrapnel wounds, from concussion. The overpressure from that many explosions in an enclosed space had killed them without leaving visible wounds. Their ears and noses bled, internal organs ruptured. They died from the shockwave alone. Detmer, the SS officer who'd survived the initial attack on December 17th, was captured during a small patrol action on December 24th. He was interrogated by American intelligence officers who wanted to understand German tactical doctrine and unit organization. But what Detmer remembered most vividly wasn't the tactical questions. It was the American officer who asked him casually how many guns the Americans had supporting this sector. When Detmer estimated maybe 100, the American smiled. "We have 348 artillery pieces registered on your approach routes. Every gun can fire 4 rounds per minute sustained. That's almost 1,400 rounds per minute. You never had a chance." The mathematics were irrefutable. The Germans had attacked American positions on Elsenborn Ridge with approximately 4,500 SS soldiers and 120 tanks and assault guns. By December 26th, when the offensive had clearly failed, they'd suffered over 3,000 casualties and lost 85 armored vehicles. Most of that damage came from artillery. Not American infantry, not American tanks. Artillery. Guns that the Germans never saw, firing from positions they couldn't locate, controlled by a fire direction system they couldn't disrupt. The artillery dominance wasn't accidental. It was the result of doctrine developed over years. Extensive training, superior communications, better survey techniques, and industrial capacity that allowed the Americans to fire as much ammunition as needed without worrying about running out. The United States was producing more artillery ammunition in a single day than Germany produced in a month. That wasn't hyperbole. That was production data. American factories were turning out shells faster than American gunners could fire them. German factories were being bombed into rubble while trying to maintain output with slave labor and dwindling raw materials. The technology helped. Proximity fuses, improved propellants that gave shells greater range and consistency, better communications equipment. But technology alone didn't win battles. Doctrine won battles. The Americans had developed a system where artillery wasn't just supporting infantry. Artillery was the main striking arm. Infantry was there to occupy ground after artillery had destroyed everything on it. The Germans never adapted to this reality. They kept trying to win through aggressive infantry assaults supported by armor, tactics that had worked in Poland and France and Russia, tactics that had no answer to massed, coordinated artillery fire. By early January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The Germans had failed to reach the Meuse, failed to capture Bastogne, failed to achieve any of their objectives. They'd lost over 800 tanks and assault guns, over 100,000 casualties, equipment and men they couldn't replace. The Americans had suffered heavily too, over 80,000 casualties. But the Americans could replace their losses. More divisions were arriving from the United States every month. More tanks, more guns, more ammunition. Germany had nothing left. The 12th SS Panzer Division limped back to Germany to refit. They'd ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The division that had terrorized Normandy, that had fought the British to a standstill at Caen, had been destroyed by American artillery in less than 2 weeks. Many of the boys who'd begun the offensive believing in German superiority and ultimate victory were dead. Those who survived had learned a terrible lesson. Courage meant nothing when you were being killed by shells fired from guns you couldn't see by men you would never fight face to face. Jürgensen, the battalion commander who'd led the initial attack on December 17th, survived the war. He was captured in February of 1945 during the final Allied push into Germany. In post-war interviews conducted by American military historians, he described the fighting at Elsenborn Ridge as worse than anything he'd experienced on the Russian front. The Russians would shell you and then attack. You could fight back. The Americans just shelled you and kept shelling you until nothing was left. You couldn't fight back. You couldn't even see who was killing you. You just died. The American gunners who delivered that destruction never saw the men they killed. They sat in firing positions miles behind the front line, loading shells and pulling lanyards based on coordinates called in by observers. It was industrial warfare in its purest form, not heroic, not glorious. Just efficient, mathematical, overwhelming. The gunners performed their duties professionally, fired their missions, cleaned their guns, slept when they could. Most of them never thought about the fact that they'd just destroyed an entire division. Madison, the forward observer who'd watched the initial attack, later calculated that his fire missions on December 17th alone had resulted in approximately 50 German casualties. 50 men dead from fire he'd called in. He didn't know their names, didn't know if they'd been soldiers or boys, didn't know if they'd had families or beliefs or hopes for the future. He knew coordinates, target numbers, impact times. That was enough. After the war, Elsenborn Ridge became a footnote in most histories of the Battle of the Bulge. The drama was at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held out against overwhelming odds. The famous story was Patton's Third Army, racing north in winter weather to relieve the siege. Elsenborn Ridge was just the northern shoulder, the place where the German advance was stopped before it really began. But military historians who studied the battle understood the truth. Bastogne was important symbolically. Elsenborn Ridge was important strategically. If the northern shoulder had collapsed, if German forces had broken through to the road network beyond the ridge, the entire Bulge might have succeeded. The war might have lasted months longer. The guns that won that battle are mostly forgotten now, scrapped after the war or left to rust in storage depots. The men who served them came home, got jobs, raised families, and rarely talked about what they'd done. Artillery wasn't glamorous, wasn't the kind of service that made for good stories, but it was effective. More effective than any weapon system employed by any army in the Second World War. German soldiers feared Russian tanks and American aircraft, but they learned to dread American artillery most of all. Edgar Brandt, the Frenchman who'd revolutionized infantry support weapons with his mortar design, might have appreciated the irony. His idea had been to give infantry their own artillery that could go everywhere infantry went. The Americans had taken that concept and industrialized it. Now infantry had their own artillery, and corps artillery, and army artillery, hundreds of guns all connected through a communications network that could concentrate their fire on any target within range. It was Brandt's vision perfected through American industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. The young SS soldiers who'd climbed toward Elsenborn Ridge on that foggy December morning had believed in their training and their equipment and their cause. They'd been taught that willpower could overcome material disadvantages, that German soldiers were superior to American soldiers, that one Panzer was worth 3 Shermans. They'd learned, in the worst way possible, that mathematics defeated faith, that industrial capacity trumped courage, that you couldn't assault into massed artillery fire and survive no matter how brave you were. Krass, the division commander, wrote in his after-action report that American artillery was the decisive factor in our defeat. Not tactics, not American bravery. Artillery. He estimated that 70% of his division's casualties came from artillery fire, not small arms, not tank guns, artillery. He recommended that future German operations avoid attacking American positions where artillery superiority couldn't be neutralized. It was a recommendation that came too late to matter. Germany had no future operations. They'd shot their last bolt at the Bulge and failed. The Americans drew different conclusions. Their artillery doctrine had been validated. Time-on-target fire worked. Massed concentrations worked. Decentralized control worked. Proximity fuses worked. After the Bulge, American commanders routinely called for artillery support as their primary response to German attacks. Why risk infantry in close combat when you could destroy the enemy from miles away? It was efficient. It saved American lives. It won battles. There's a photograph taken at Elsenborn Ridge in late December of 1944. It shows a destroyed German Panther tank, turret blown off, sitting in a snow-covered field. In the background, you can see American soldiers walking past it without even looking. Just another knocked-out tank, nothing special. That casualness captures something important. To the Americans, the destruction of German armor had become routine. Expected, not because they were better soldiers than the Germans, though many were experienced and well-trained, but because they had better systems, better logistics, better coordination, and overwhelmingly superior artillery. The Germans never developed an answer. They tried spreading out their formations to reduce artillery effectiveness. That made them vulnerable to American infantry and armor. They tried massing rapidly for breakthrough attacks. American artillery destroyed them during the massing. They tried attacking at night or in fog. American fire direction centers had pre-planned concentrations that didn't require observation. They tried counter-battery fire against American guns. They couldn't find them all and didn't have enough ammunition to engage the ones they did find. Every tactical solution created new problems that artillery could exploit. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge demonstrated what total war meant in the industrial age. It wasn't about individual courage or tactical brilliance. It was about systems, logistics, industrial capacity, communications. The side that could bring more resources to bear and coordinate them effectively would win. The Germans had courage and tactical skill in abundance. They didn't have the industrial base or the logistics to support an offensive against an enemy who could fire 1,400 artillery shells per minute indefinitely. That was the real story of Elsenborn Ridge. Not American heroism, though there was plenty of that. Not German failure, though that occurred. Just mathematics. Cold, pitiless, and absolute. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.